Good evening. My name is Brent Orell. I'm a resident fellow here at AEI, and I do spend most of my time working on workforce development and also criminal justice reform and reentry and topics like that. It's my pleasure to welcome you here. For decades, we've been concerned about the erosion of the manufacturing base. Arguably, I think, the displacement of workers from the manufacturing and other heavy industry sectors, especially since the 80s, has been the dominant economic, employment, and social concern of policymakers in the U.S. and other developing countries. And I also believe that there's a consensus that it's really one of the chief drivers of some of the worst social trends that we're seeing today. Some have argued that the disappearance of these jobs is a primary source of political populism as well. Workers, the story goes, are mad as hell, and they aren't going to take it anymore. As these middle-income jobs have dried up through a combination of automation and offshoring, we've relied on growth in the service sector to pick up the slack. Office parks have replaced factories, and brain power has replaced brawn. But is this equation changing? Are service jobs the new manufacturing jobs? Increasingly exposed to automation and global competition through a combination of improved information communication technology and the proliferation of broadband internet. Will we soon see physicians, accountants, and attorneys join the list of those occupations handled by skilled workers in distant places willing to work at a fraction of American wages? Our guest today, Dr. Richard Baldwin, has been giving these questions some thought in his recent book, The Globotics Upheaval, Globalization, Robotics, and the Future of Work. Building on his previous book, The Great Convergence, Information Technology and the New Globalization, Dr. Baldwin argues that digital technology allows talented foreigners to telecommute into our workplaces and compete for service and professional jobs. This challenge, he argues, will be heightened by the growth of artificial intelligence that will help further reduce barriers to telemigration through deep language translation programs. Super smart computers and robotics may also directly reduce the need for human labor through a growing capacity to mimic human social interaction. Our program for exploring these themes this evening goes as follows. Dr. Baldwin will provide some introductory remarks that summarize the arguments of Globotics Upheaval. After he concludes, he will be joined on stage by Dr. Harry Holzer, a professor of public policy at Georgetown University's McCourt School, Michael Strain, AEI's Director of Economic Studies, and myself. Dr. Holzer is going to give a short response to Dr. Baldwin's presentation, and then we'll have a conversation to tease out some of the areas of differing perspectives and emphases on the important questions raised in Dr. Baldwin's book. So now, please join me in welcoming Richard Baldwin.
Well, thank you very much, Brent. But I brought the book just in case you hadn't seen it. First of all, my thanks to Brent and AEI for organizing this discussion on what I think is a very important set of conversations, and loosely organizing it around my book, although I view this as a conversation not just on the book, but the basic issues. I'd also like to apologize to all of you for being such an amateur on so many of these issues. This book has forced me to color way outside the lines of my traditional academic training, which is just as a trade economist or a globalization. And I've had to deal with artificial intelligence and labor economics and all sorts of things. Had a great time doing it. But I'm not sorry. I think one of the troubles with our profession now is that people are too siloed, and they're therefore ignoring the big questions and not putting them together. And that's what I'm hoping to do in this book. The last apology, if you will, or not really an apology, is that I'm going to be talking about the future today. And when you talk about the future, you're just making it up. I'm making it up, you're making it up. So when I say this will happen, don't write that down. Write down the ways I'm thinking about how I'm thinking about the future, because all of you will have to think through the future. And the absolute worst way to think through the future is to pretend it's going to be like it is now. Especially when we live in an era where digital technology is transforming many things, not everything, but many things, at an explosive pace. So let me just get started on this with my slides. This is the sort of summary of the whole book, and I know many of you will get back to doing your emails on your phones and stuff. That's okay too. I'll pretend you're live tweeting my event, so I won't be offended at all. But for the next 30 seconds, please pay attention to this. This is my point. The Globotics Upheaval. I think digital technology is launching automation, which you can call AI, and globalization, which you can call RI for remote intelligence, at the same time. And this automation and this globalization, which I smashed together into the word globotics, is affecting service sector and professional jobs in a way that I believe is coming faster than most people think and in ways few expect. And in some sense, my book is just going down to the village square and ringing the bell and saying, we don't know what's going to happen, but it's probably going to happen faster than most people think. So now you can go back to doing your emails. Okay. I want to convince you that we're at the beginning of a third great transformation. Here, the way I think about it. Mechanical power launched a transformation from the farms to the factories. It gave enormous power to manual workers, and therefore, ultimately, was equalizing. Income inequality fell for almost 100 years, from 1870 to 1970, and that was because this technology took the horse out of horsepower and put it into manpower. It helped people work with their heads a little bit, but it wasn't the main event. From about 1970, computers and telecoms led the transition from factories to offices. So for example, from about 1970, the number of jobs in factories in the United States started to fall, and pretty much everywhere else in the G7 started to fall then, as they moved into offices. But this was a very different type of technology. This was a technology that provided better substitutes for people who work with their hands, but better tools for people who work with their heads. But to make those tools work, things like spreadsheets and databases, and you had to have a university degree. So there was something of a skill shift. It undermined people who work with their hands and reinforced the productivity of people who work with their heads, and that led to an increase in inequality that's been going on since about 1970 in most countries around the world, at least in pre-tax and transfer incomes. I would argue that starting about 2016, digital technology has launched a third transformation, which will move people from service sector jobs to what I'd like to call sheltered service sector jobs, a term that I'm going to explain more in detail. But now this is a long book. It's 200 pages long, so I had to decide between two strategies tonight. I either talk really, really fast or I skip a few bits. And I assume that most of you didn't want to hear me talk fast. So what I'm going to do is spend most of my time trying to convince you that this time is different. That it's not just more of ICT, and therefore we don't have to think very hard of it. I would like to convince you that this is something quite different, and therefore requires some rethinking. Okay. So first of all, it's a different globalization and a different automation. Globalization, which I'd like you to think of as RI, or remote intelligence, is taking the form of things like telemigration, which is another word I made up, where people sit in one country and work in offices in another via digital means. It could be something as simple as Skype, but it could be telepresence or telepresence robots. Or more generally, it's trade and services. So those of you who are trade nerds, it's just mode 1 trade and services. And automation is very different. Almost every day in your news feeds, you see pictures of these incredibly interesting, sexy, almost robots that do things physically. I call those steel-collar robots, and to contrast them with white-collar robots. And what's really moving the dial on automation now is software robots that automate service sector jobs. Now, there's a high end of this and a low end of it. At the low end, the most common one's called robotic process automation, or RPA. And if you've never heard of RPA, you really should look it up, because, not right now, I'm talking now, but look it up because it's changing the world of office work very fast. It's essentially like a player piano for many, many things. At the high end, there's these virtual assistants like Watson and Amelia and Rachel. There's lots and lots of companies have these higher end things, and also in law, in journalism, in finance, software robots are taking over high-end jobs. So just to spin that out, a different sector is affected. We're talking about the service and professional jobs, not just factory jobs. And if I could get you to remember one thing from tonight, it's that you should not use analogies from what happened in the manufacturing sector in the last 2 decades to think about what's going to happen in the service sector the next 5 or 10 years. Very different things. Office and professional workers are different. First of all, there's lots of them. 80 to 90% of the workforce in most countries, including this one, are in the service sector. Most of those people felt sorry for the manufacturing workers when they lost their jobs. This time, it's going to affect their job. Second, they're easier to reemploy, but it'll happen in a different way. So for the most part, service sector workers all up and down the lines have more flexible skill sets. And service sector jobs have a lot more overlap than, for example, being a Chrysler worker in Wisconsin versus something else. And many of them are in cities where there are other jobs. So the displacement of shutting down a factory in a remote part of France is not as disruptive. But they're not going to end up with the same job, and frequently they end up with downgrade unemployment. So my favorite example is a journalist in London. If you go back 10, 12 years ago, all of them had good jobs with newspapers, career prospects, pensions in the bank. They could plan their family holidays. Now they're still doing journalism, still in London, but most of them are freelancers. They're unemployed. Their income probably has fallen. It's certainly more uncertain, and it's very difficult to plan family holidays or get a mortgage with this kind of uncertain stream. So it's downgrade unemployment, not unemployment in the classical sense. They're not ready for it, because up till now, their jobs were shielded from globalization by the fact that most services were non-traded, and it was shielded from automation because computers couldn't think in many ways. It's a different physics. So information and communication technology, ICT, which has been going on since the 70s or 80s, depending upon where you time it, is digital technology, but it affected, in terms of what I'm talking about, mostly the manufacturing sector, mining, agriculture. Now, that meant that the information and the communication was only a small bit of it, a catalyst, but most of it was still physical. Now, when it's affecting the service sector, it's mostly communication and information, and therefore it's mostly governed by the laws of electrons, not the laws of matter. Now, just to be concrete, how long do you think it takes to double the flows of imports and exports of goods? And the answer is 2 decades. If you ask how long does it take to double the flows of information across borders, the answer is 2 years. So if you're thinking globalization and automation of the service sector is going to implicitly move at the pace it did in the manufacturing sector, you're using the wrong physics. There's a different programming. This is why, in my mind, we're in a completely different world. Many of you will have seen this book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. How many of you have read it, looked at it? If you haven't, it's a great book. It was written by a psychologist, but got the Nobel Prize in economics, and we economists are still burned up about that because there aren't many of these things left, and they gave it a psychologist. But anyways, what he points out is that humans have 2 very different ways of thinking: conscious, effortful, logical. That's what he calls system 2. And unconscious, effortless, and things you can do many times. That's what he calls system one. Now the point is that the thinking slow tasks, like figuring out what a 15% tip is on a $137 restaurant bill, that's effortful. But the key is you know how you do it. Therefore, you can write a computer program to teach a computer to do it, and we did. But when you recognize a picture of a cat in a video or walk down an uneven stairs without falling down, that's thinking fast, and you have no idea how you do it because it's not logical. And therefore, in the old way of programming computers, we could not teach computers to do thinking fast things. Now we can with machine learning. Machine learning programs computers in a completely, radically different way. It takes a large structured data set and estimates a statistical model, which then guesses. So as a consequence, since 2016, computers have acquired a whole range of thinking skills that they never had before that are thinking fast skills, like facial recognition, like handwriting recognition, like recognizing large patterns. All these things, natural language processing, machine translation, none of these were possible before because we were programming in a different way. Problem is mismatched speed. Digital technology is driving job displacement. Human ingenuity is driving job creation. So, usually in this debate, people will ask you to be either an optimist when it comes to jobs and automation, forgetting about globalization, that's a different thing, or a pessimist, that we're going to have the job apocalypse and we need universal basic income because nobody will have the money to make the things that robots are making. I am first a pessimist, then an optimist. And the reason, in my mind, is that digital technology is being used by the AI geniuses to displace jobs. That's the business model. That's how they're planning to become billionaires in the next few years. They gather a great big data set on something that humans are doing right now, mostly in the service sector. They train they train a model using various algorithms to replace some of those jobs, and they become a billionaire in the next few years. These same skills that are being put into computer programs, judgment and subtle recognition, those will create a huge number of jobs which make average people smarter than they are before, doing all sorts of things that used to require 20 years experience. But you will not become a billionaire in the next 5 years by doing that. So for example, in the UK, where they have a desperate shortage of nurses, the health system has approved an app called Babylon Health, which is on cell phones, which helps you decide whether you should call to make a doctor's appointment, because they had too many nurses answering this. So they've approved this thing going in. And they have diagnostic tools that nurses can use. Now, when you think about that, a nurse using one of these diagnostic things becomes vastly more productive than before, and in some sense creates a semi-professional job. But to create those jobs, we would have to change the regulation. We would have to change the reimbursement. We would have to change attitudes. That is not how you're going to get rich. So in the long run, the AI and the automation and the outsourcing will create all the jobs we need, but that's driven by human ingenuity and entrepreneurship, which will take its good old time. I'm running through these things because I only have 4 minutes left. I still have to talk about the future, and the future is really a long thing. So you can laugh, it's okay. How about this? I'll say something, look expectant, and that's your cue to laugh, okay? Should we practice once? Okay, so now it won't look like a factory closure. There will be no mass unemployment, Rust Belt style. It'll look like this. How many of you have been at a table like this? Okay? How many of you had to make rules about people doing this at the table? Okay, raise your hand, please. This is audience participation. How many of you have broken your own rules? Okay, all of us? Okay, there we go. The point is, I believe this is how Globots, automation, and offshoring will come into our work life. If you think back 10 years ago, 12 years ago, when this thing was launched, Steve Jobs was so happy it did three things. It was a mediocre cell phone with a poor battery life, and it still is. It was a great music player and a web browser that wasn't much used because there wasn't Wi-Fi anywhere back then. But one innovation at a time, one improvement at a time, these things have transformed our lives. Not just our work lives, our social lives, our family lives, our love lives. It's changed the way we interact with our cities. It's changed enormous things. But here's the point. Nobody decided to let that happen. Nobody even knew it was going to happen because it was the outcome of billions of seemingly small, seemingly unrelated decisions that fundamentally transformed the way we work. And I think that's how telemigrants and software automation will come into our lives. One little task at a time, one little outsource at a time. We won't even think it's a trend until 5 or 10 years down the road. It will have transformed the way we work, as it has, by the way, in things like web development. Okay. Thinking about long-run future of work. What I'd like to invite you to do is think about it as a process of elimination. Globots will do what they can. We will do what Globots can't. So the question is, what can't Globots do? So the usual way of going about this is, what will be the jobs of the future so I know what to tell my children to study? That's the wrong way to go about it because we can't know what those jobs are. When we left the farms to the factories, the people leaving the farms did not know that they would be in the pharmaceutical industry or the car industry because there wasn't one. But they could think hard about what they would be doing in the factory. They would be doing in the factory things that couldn't be done through mechanical power. Same way here. AI can't do human. That's the answer. I have a longer set of going through it, but if you look at things like McKinsey Global Institute or World Economic Forum, there's a bunch of people who've said, what can AI do, what it can't do? And you squint your eyes, it's the most human tasks that AI can't do and won't be able to do for a long time. So when I think about that, I like to say machine learning is the jet engine, but big data is the jet fuel. So which task in your job can't be captured with large structured data set? That's what the jobs of the future will be dominated by, because they won't be automated, because we can't get the data. What can't RI do, remote intelligence? Well, these are telemigrants who are real people. The only thing they can't do is be in the same room. So my argument is if you have a job or a task where you don't actually have to be in the room, it will be eventually outsourced or done remotely. So what's left is the long-run future of work is more human, more local jobs. We'll be richer because productivity will be higher, hopefully more generous. But the trouble is we have to manage the transition. Now, you've all read the estimates. Some people say 40% in 10 years through automation and another 25 or 30% through offshoring. That will be an upheaval. We will have to do something about it. If it's at the low ends, slowly, we won't have to do anything about it. So really, I think the question is managing the transition and standing ready to slow it down if it ends up going too fast. Thank you.
Should I start right away? Or?
Yeah, no, that's fine. Do you want to, you're to stand. Okay.
Yeah.
That's fine.
So I'm waiting for my slides to appear.
Yeah,
Oh, click.
advance them. Yeah.
There's a lot of these. See all what you missed?
Oh, that's me.
There we go.
Okay. Thank you to Brent, again, for organizing this and inviting me to participate. Thank you to Richard for writing what is a stimulating and provocative book and generating today's discussion. I'm very glad to be here. I was not going to do slides originally, just as Michael is not doing slides. The problem with that is Michael is actually young enough to remember what he wanted to say, just by looking at a few notes. Maybe Richard and I are not in that category. On the other hand, having seen your great slides, and I slapped these together yesterday afternoon sitting on my deck at home, so I apologize for the drabness of my slides and compared to Richard's. But
You got to hire a telemigrant.
Yeah, the time was a little too short for that. So the book is interesting, and there's actually several different analyses in the book, some of which Richard covered and some not. So it's a really interesting historical chapter where he talks about previous episodes of industrial upheaval, especially the Industrial Revolution, and in his view, how that generated communism, fascism, and the New Deal. As you might expect, he likes the New Deal better than the other two. I tend to agree with him on that. I also tend to thought there's other variables floating around in business cycle and nationalism and things like that. But that's fine. That's not really central to today's conversation. He described the great upheaval that he thinks will be caused by Globotics. This time is different. But then he argues that humans will retain an important comparative advantage in being human, and that will define an increasing fraction of jobs. And Richard didn't talk much about policy today, but when he gets to his policy section, it's sort of like really more of the same, a little more of the same, a little faster. And there's a real dissonance, I think, between the drama of all the upheaval that Richard is expecting. But then the analysis gets a lot more conventional about comparative advantage and policy things. So you're struck sometimes being a little unsettled that if you believe that all this drama is coming, why don't the policy, where's the drama in the policy side that might be needed to respond to that? I'll come back to the policy things in a few minutes. I find Richard's analysis reasonable and convincing at some level, but these are kind of very, very stylized observations about automation in the labor market. I think it's well-informed speculation, but anybody's predictions are going to have really wide confidence intervals around them, whether they're Richard's or anybody else's. Even if you agree on the shapes of those diagrams he showed, the magnitudes, the speed can be very different. And there was actually very good, the National Academies of Science had a report just 2 years ago on automation and how it's going to affect the labor market. David Autor, some of the other top folks in computer science, and they kind of said there's so many variables that are going to determine how this all gets implemented and the speed at which it gets implemented. Input prices, consumer preferences, all kinds of institutional factors determining management decisions. And the skills that people pick up in responses that it's very hard to predict with any accuracy or any certainty. And I think that remains true today, and I don't think Richard disagrees with that. And I do want to remember the hysteria about offshoring 15 years ago. 15 years ago, the view was all the jobs are going to go to China and India, and nothing will be left. And some very good economists, like Alan Blinder, wrote some famous pieces on that that Richard talks about. And it might be, I was going to say, that should give us a little bit of caution before we predict this kind of drama. And Richards was saying, Blinder maybe will end up being right, just the timing. He might be a little, that remains to be seen. I just, people make predictions about when these dramatic changes are going to occur, and sometimes they have that in their face because it just doesn't turn out that way, or at least the speed. And this may be one of those times. Having said that, I think there is some analysis that can be done here, and sort of the second part of Richard's book, where he starts talking about the comparative advantage of humans in human-type work, he's right about. And there's a long literature. Economists have always, all the different times in the past where people have predicted jobs are going to disappear. There was an automation scare in the late 50s and early 60s when people first started worrying about computers. You go back now and you look at that stuff, and it really does sound like today's. Other times, like the offshoring drama of about 15 years ago, it's never happened. And economists believe that it won't happen because there are all these economic forces that tend to create new jobs. If automation raises our productivity, people's real incomes go up, they have more to spend, they spend it in new places. And there's a whole well-understanding, and Richard's work is very consistent with that. So jobs are not going to disappear, and I agree with him, and my guess is most of you in the room, universal basic income is not something a good idea for all kinds of reasons. And we shouldn't be thinking about that right now. And even some of my friends on the left who want publicly guaranteed jobs at $15 an hour, that's certainly very premature and probably a wrong way to think about this. Or all people just want protection. And Richard worries about protectionism a lot in his book. All those are bad ideas, and we agree with that. Having said that, the basic idea that millions of workers may experience dislocation because of these technologies, that sounds to me like a very reasonable possibility. And that those dislocations will have important implications for the growth, economic growth, standards of living, inequality, labor force participation. Those are all major things that could happen, and we don't want to get too complacent. It's a mistake for my comments to be interpreted that we should be complacent or sanguine, because I think even when you allow for the stuff Richard said about new jobs will be created, et cetera, a lot of disruption will occur. Human beings don't like disruption, and it is something to worry about and plan for a little bit. Well, Richard's international guy, knows a lot about automation. Michael and I are labor economists, so I thought maybe we'd bring a few things from our toolkit to sort of flesh this out. And one of the things, one point in Richard's talk, he mentioned tasks. And a lot of labor economics is actually moving in the direction of talking about tasks as opposed to jobs. If you look at people, most of us don't do one thing in our jobs. We have a whole range of tasks that we do. And when economists start to think about this, they quickly come to the conclusion some of those tasks we do will be more quickly automatable than others. And so there's a burgeoning body of literature, and Richard mentioned the McKinsey report, and some other folks have looked at this. Not the first study that talked about this 40% displacement did not think about tasks, and that's why everybody thinks the Frey and Osborne paper was just way off base. We have data on the tasks people do in the jobs. There's two good data sources. In the US, there's something called ONET that the Labor Department puts out about fairly detailed occupations and the task performance. And then there's an OECD survey across 20-some countries called the PIAC data, P-I-A-A-C, where they survey people a lot of what tasks do you do at work and what skills you need to have to do those tasks. So we have two good sources of data on people's tasks, and then you combine those data with things that computer scientists have written about which of these tasks will be easily automatable in the next 10 years or 20 years. So you get these predictions. But the predictions are not 0-1, that these jobs will be eliminated and these won't. It's like what fractions of the tasks on these different jobs will likely be automated over the next 10, 20 years. That's where most of the literature is going. And those analyses, the ones that I consider good, all kind of say maybe 10% of workers in this time period will face high task automatability, where maybe 70% of the tasks we can measure will be automated. Lots of other folks are in that mixed 30%, 50%, something like that. And those numbers strike me, again, with huge confidence intervals around each of them, those strike me as being sensible. The methodology sounds sensible as well as the results. One other concept that we use a lot in labor economics, complementary versus substitutable skills. Very simply, if your skills are substitutable by machines, that's a bad situation. You're going to get displaced. If you're more complementary with machine, like the humanist, that's a good thing. Then the more the machines exist, the more demand there will be. And of course, the entire adjustment process for workers, when they have some of these substitutable skills, is to develop more of the complementary stuff. And all the retraining, in some sense, will involve that, and the new skills we'll be trying to teach our kids and grandkids will also involve teaching them things that we regard as more complementary. So what does all this mean, and what implications does it have? And part of my argument that we shouldn't be too complacent about this. Richard talks a lot about the vulnerability of white-collar and educated workers. Some of their tasks will get automated. But you look at all of these analyses, it says, on average, for those folks, maybe 30 to 40% of their tasks will be automatable, not the vast majority. The folks who are much more threatened, whose 70% of their tasks will be automatable, not 30%, continue to be less educated workers. Workers without BAs or some of the BAs. Their stuff remains. It's been true for the last 40 years. The people doing routine work get automated by computers, and it continues to be true today in all these other analyses. So the incidence of displacement will likely be higher for those folks, and at the same time, their ability to adjust, to go back to college, to go online and learn new stuff will be weaker. So in some sense, I still worry more about those folks. We all will manage, and our kids will manage, and we will learn new skills and be able to do new tasks. Other folks will have a harder time with that, and that's where I think we ought to be worried. These things will raise productivity. Rising productivity is usually a good thing. It tends to increase compensation because it increases the size of the pie. On the other hand, machines will take up the slice of GDP going to capital will continue to grow. The slice going to labor will continue to get narrow. So the pie is getting bigger, but the labor slice will get narrower. Maybe that will raise overall compensation, maybe not. But what I'm quite sure about is that inequality in the labor market will continue to rise. And the people who really are being displaced, who are not in position to really retrain very easily, will, as they are doing now, drop out of the labor market, perhaps in bigger magnitudes. I think skill shortages will become more frequent because, very simply, there will be new demand for tasks to be done and skills that people don't yet have. And I think a lot of this will be aggravated by demographics and other changes that are occurring. So where do we end up on the policy side? And I think the policies are quite consistent with Richard's vision. And it's things many economists have sort of say how you adjust to this stuff. So I list several policies for workers. Number one, there's a set of things called 21st century skills, the kind of human type things Richard talked about, also creativity, also the kinds of analysis that depend on judgment, things like that. We will need to teach our kids and our grandkids more of those skills to be more complementary. Lifelong learning, so the people who are threatened with replacement can go back pretty quickly. And by the way, there are states that are already instituting payroll deduction systems so that a little bit of money each month gets put away in a lifelong learning account if and when you need that. And we'll need to strengthen our community colleges, our workforce development systems, where a lot of this retraining will work. Wage insurance, an old economist idea that if the good paying jobs disappear and folks can get low wage jobs, but they're loath to take them, the government can make up maybe part of that loss and incentivize people to stay in the labor market. And things like universal health benefits, less tied to jobs. And I think it's really nuts. You know, people in this town, some people, are so obsessed with crippling and then repealing ACA. I think we ought to be trying to strengthen ACA so people are less and less dependent on that for having these high wage jobs they have right now. So those are some of the adjustments. But I think policies can influence employers as well. Employers have a lot of choice about how they're going to implement these technologies and which workers they will choose to retrain for new tasks versus letting them go. I think socially it's better if they retrain. So if there's a big public good associated with retraining, we ought to be subsidizing more of it. And that's one thing you can do on the employer side. We can also consider taxes on really high worker displacement. This is not a robotics tax. I think robotics tax is a really stupid idea. But a tax on displacement, a modest-sized tax, because if it imposes a public bad on the economy, the people generating that bad ought to be paying for more of it, and we already do that, by the way. We have this thing called experience rating of unemployment insurance taxes, where the firms that generate a lot of layoffs pay higher taxes, as they should. This would be maybe strengthening the part of UI experience rating and maybe having it focus more on displacement. So those are all policy things I think we can do that would generate a fair amount of consensus. And kind of sensible people on the sort of center left and sensible people on the center right, I think could come together and agree on this. Just a couple of problems with that should be fairly obvious to people. Number one, the sensible folks are not necessarily in charge of any political parties these days. And that massive political polarization, I think, is gonna impede people to do kinds of sensible things that probably all of us on stage could agree on. And one more thing, and this always drives me a little nuts. The things in Richard's book that he talks about cost money. The things that I talked about in my list cost money. And where's that fiscal resource going to come from? We're living in an era of fiscal madness, fiscal insanity, where Americans already have all these generous benefits that they refuse to pay for at all. and they've been told by many of their politicians they don't have to pay for that. Both sides are complicit in that, but I would argue that they're not equally complicit. And I think that the fact that, and I won't say which party I blame more, because then I'd be really partisan, right? I shouldn't do that. What I will say is that one party, 90% of the people down the street on Capitol Hill have signed a pledge to never, ever, 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 ever raise taxes. Doesn't matter, wartime, natural disasters, never, taxes uber alles. I would imply that that's really going to impede some of these sensible adjustments. So I keep waiting for my conservative friends here today, my sensible conservative, to stand up and speak out against the madness. They haven't done it yet, but life is long. You know, maybe sometime before I die, they will find their voice. Or maybe not. Anyway, those are some of the thoughts I have. And again, thank you to Brent and Richard for this, and looking forward to the conversation.
Great. Thanks, Harry. Okay, so the only person up here who hasn't had a chance to say anything yet is Dr. Strang.
I'd like to begin by going on the record against the madness.
You got to say it out of this room, though.
Well, this is being telecast.
I think this conversation about the future of work and automation and what its effects will be is very important. It's a very active conversation with many participants. Richard's book is a worthy addition to that conversation. I agree with a lot of Harry's diagnosis. I think it's important to shift this conversation away from absolutes and binary choices and toward more of a probabilistic framework. That applies both to the risk that workers face. There are some things that may be a 0-1 risk. It may be that we either have long-haul truck drivers or we don't. But that's not the situation that most people will find themselves in. I think if you think about your own work life and how it might compare to someone in the same nominal occupation as you 20 years ago, there have been some significant changes, and some of those changes have been driven by technology. That process will continue. So the question, I don't think, is whether the robots will take all our jobs or what share of jobs the robots will take. The question instead is how will automation and globalization change what people do when they get up and go to work? And what types of workers and what types of occupations are more at risk of significant and rapid change. The second area where I think it would be helpful to move away from this kind of 0-1 mentality and toward more of a probabilistic model is the magnitude of the risk. It will not be the case, I agree with Harry and Richard, that it will not be the case that we will wake up 20 years from now and there will be no human workers. It also will not be the case that we'll wake up 20 years from now and things will be identical to how they are in 2019. So the question, I think, is what is the likelihood that there will be really significant change? What is the likelihood that we are on the exponential part of the, well, what is the likelihood that the curve is exponential? And secondly, what's the likelihood that we are getting to the point on the curve where the pace of change is going to explode? It seems to me that even if you think the likelihood is relatively small, you'd want a robust policy response, and you'd want that policy response to begin being formulated now rather than after we have potentially millions of people whose lives are being significantly disrupted. I think if you look at the last few decades, you see that an inadequate policy response to automation and globalization-driven labor market change has had negative consequences, not just for the lives of people who were affected, but also, I think, for the health of our society. And that, I think, is where a significant amount of the focus should be. That's where Harry concluded his presentation. Of course, Richard has a great discussion of that in the book as well. And that's, I think, where a lot of the conversation needs to take place. And hopefully there can be some productive advances in that conversation. And hopefully this evening is part of that. So I will end on that optimistic note, Brent.
Okay, great. Okay, your turn.
No. I'm just going to say thanks for that. I wrote down a couple things that I like. That this is a debate about the nature of work, not the future of work. I like that because of course there's going to be work. But it's going to be different. And I very much appreciate what you said about we don't know how likely that this is going to turn into the Yellow Vests, meet the Battle for Seattle, meet the LA riots. We don't know. But, it's probably worthwhile preparing for it because certainly it's going to come. And I appreciated very much what Harry was saying. He explained about this thing about the task in much greater depth. And that also brought into focus the labor economists. It's not jobs. And I can't count the number of times aggressive journalists have said, these jobs, how are they going to be there when I've been giving my book? And the answer is almost all the jobs will be there. They'll just be very different. And so I really appreciate that. And you also explained I wasn't as bold to say which of these estimates is closer. And so you were going for the OECD ones, which are task-based. And I think the number is 14% there of significant. Well, it depends upon how disruptive it was. But in any case, it's still a big number. That's 1 out of 6 people having to significantly change their jobs. So I'll just leave it with that. And I think I don't have anything to pick bones with.
No other bones to pick. Okay. So Harry, I was curious what you thought about Richard's presentation on this question of speed of transformation. Did you have any thoughts about that? I mean, what's from your perspective, what's likely, what's the history,
Well, the fact that some things are straight lines and other things are more quadratic, or I don't have a big. We don't know. Number one. Number two, based on what we've seen and the kind of forces Richard talked about, it's quite possible that some of these changes will be very nonlinear. Having said that, there's a big difference between something that goes like this and something that much more gradually get there. And I think there's, in the National Academy's report in 2017, they talk about all the different variables that will affect the speed, the reach, the diffusion through the economy, and they end up saying, there's so many variables that we can't predict with. So I guess that's my reaction, that it might be reasonable to think that one of them is much less linear than the other. At the same time, you think of all those variables and the timing, the diffusion, all of those things will not diffuse into the economy all at once. Some of them a little faster, some a little slower, which should also give us, and I think interacting with all these institutional factors and educational factors, and so the general concept may well be true, but exactly what magnitudes we're talking about, nobody has any idea.
and there'll be a lot of unevenness across sectors.
That's right.
There'll be, some
regions.
Yeah, and regions. People are going to get hit at different paces and speeds and so on. So that makes sense. So, Michael, I wanted to press you just a little bit on the policy issues. What did you think of the menu of policy options that either Harry or Richard or both of them put forward in terms of, I mean, you indicate there's an urgency here to start thinking about this now, but what do you think about the policy options that are available to us?
I mean, I think we have some very good policy options. You know, I think we want a few things. We want a safety net for people so that nobody falls too far. That safety net, we know what that looks like, and we have that. We want incentives to encourage people to participate in the workforce in a time of transition. We have policies on the books like the Earned Income Tax Credit that offer that. We want for people to be building human capital. We want people's skills to evolve with the needs of the marketplace. And there I think we know less about how to do that well than we know how to subsidize employment or provide unemployment insurance for people or those sorts of things. But we're not completely in the dark there. Models of work-based learning have shown a good amount of promise. I think Harry's suggestions around community college and 21st century skills are absolutely right on target. And I think we don't want to let employers completely off the hook. And there are things public policy can do to encourage businesses to invest in their workers, and we should be looking very seriously at those things, particularly if the investment is one that benefits the firm and that the firm has an interest in doing and just needs a little push. So there's a real basket of things we can do, and we have better evidence on some than on others, but the evidence is there, I think, across the board for those sorts of policies to be looking harder at them. And then I think we need to kind of zoom out and look really across all areas of domestic and economic policy to think about whether or not we're doing things in the right way. I think a lot about K through 12 curriculum and what are the skills that we're teaching people. Does it make sense to be hammering into people the ability to add really complicated series of numbers together when everybody's walking around the world with an iPhone? Does it make sense to the way that labor economists think about this, skills that substitute for technology, skills that complement technology? One of the things that computers can't do is work together in a creative fashion. One of the things that computers can't do, or robots can't do, is work really well with people in an interpersonal sense. Why don't we invest more in those sorts of skills in K through 12 curriculum rather than invest in things that computers will always be able to do better than any human being alive? And on and on and on. Right. There's a lot to be done and a lot that we can do.
But yeah. I guess the thing that might make us the most pessimistic about any of this is, we've had skill-biased technical change from digital developments for 40 years. How well have we adapted in the 40 years to that? One can argue that the current wave of populism running through America is driven partly by immigration and things like that, but also by this, what people call the China shock on trade to manufacturing that was heavily concentrated into certain regions. That was about 2.5 million people from that. How well did we deal with that? Those were smaller dislocations and all the sensible things that Michael and I and Richard have all listed where we all agree. Either we didn't do any of those things or we didn't do them very well. So that's where I think you can get.
Why didn't we do them? What happened? Why didn't we do them well?
The political incentives are often not for folks to emphasize things that have these costs and doing things differently. I mean, why do people in the K through 12 world because they like doing the things the way they've done, and there are big adjustment costs, and no one wants to bear those adjustment costs. So a combination of bad politics, bad fiscal situation, and just that people like doing what they've learned how to do. The costs of change.
We sort of nodded toward this when, in the mid-90s with things like trade adjustment assistance and, other Labor Department initiatives that were theoretically supposed to help people. What happened with those? That were supposed to help people as we adjusted to this incoming wave of trade.
So many economists and many conservatives will say, whenever you go to do policy, things screw up. And there's all kinds of, either you don't do it well or it creates adverse incentives. Policies like TAA give people a lot of money for a while not to do very much. And then when it came to the training piece, we didn't really know. I mean, I think actually in the last 5 to 10 years, with much better data, and we've learned much more about the kind of training, sub-BA at communities that works. We didn't really know that back in the 90s. So, maybe we kept trying to do it in ways. Now we have that knowledge and we have a better sense of what it costs. But again, the fiscal barriers and things like that prevent us from, as well. I mean, I'm probably the guy on this stage who should be the least critical of tenure. because I have it, and these guys don't. And yet, quite frankly, at community colleges, the folks teaching anthropology want to keep teaching anthropology. They don't want to really particularly want to teach machine tooling, and you know, the incentives and the resources are not. And by the way, I think the community colleges are vastly underfunded, given all the hats we expect them to wear to do this stuff. But yeah, they're not the forces to try to do things differently in that world. Those things are hard to move as well.
Okay, so I'm only going to press on this one more time, but what do you think we know now that we didn't know then?
I think we know how to deliver what people call sector-based training, where instead of just training somebody and throwing them out into the labor market, in advance you convene people and create partnerships between employers in the high-demand, high-wage industries that are often very tight. We know what they are: healthcare, advanced manufacturing, IT, et cetera. And you bring together the community colleges, the training providers. You create these curricula for training people for those jobs, and then you work with the employers to make sure that what you're training is what they like. And the evidence in those things are much stronger. And then, as Michael said, we know a lot more about work-based learning and what works in that realm, apprenticeships, things like that. Now, there's always tension. You know, the sector-based stuff, the apprenticeship stuff, puts a lot of weight on quite specific skills that match what employers demand today. Richard's whole point is what they demand today may be very different than what they demand tomorrow. So how do you get that right mix of sort of general skill building versus specific to current demand? You know, and so you have tensions on those things that are hard to resolve, but those are some of the things that work pretty well, right? You know, the evidence is vastly stronger on positive impacts of those things than kind of CETA, JTPA type training.
Right.
Can I make 3 points on that? I think Harry's exactly right that we've learned a lot more about how to do training effectively. And the way that I think about it is that we have incorporated more market information into training. The logic of work-based learning programs is that businesses determine the training curriculum in some sense, and that businesses have opportunities available for trainees if it makes business sense. Well, if it makes business sense, then they're learning something that actually is valuable in the private market, which is the whole point of training to begin with. So there have been some real advances there. The second point I would make in the kind of general conversation, Brent, that you launched is not to overstate the importance of trade in the kind of domestic political upheaval that we've seen. It's true, of course, that trade has cost some manufacturing jobs, but technological automation has really displaced many more workers than trade has, and the so-called
I would suspect that many workers don't draw that distinction in their minds either, right? Like that automation and trade are the same.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think a lot don't. I think probably fewer don't draw that distinction after 3 or 4 years of President Trump pounding around the public square, yelling and screaming about China. But analytically and in terms of how we design policy, of course, it matters. What's driving the lion's share of that displacement. And the third point I would make is not to I mean, this almost sounds ridiculous to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. Not to overweight the importance of the wave of populism that we've seen in the last few years in terms of thinking about how to design policies to help address displacement. We have had these longer-term, slower-burning trends reshaping the labor market for decades. Skill-biased technological change, certainly I think is at the top of the list. And those kind of eat away at the labor market month by month, year by year. That was true in the 1980s, it was true in the 1990s, it was true in the 2000s, all the way up until the Great Recession. And it took a once-in-a-generation financial crisis and global recession to create this current wave of populism that we've seen. That was kind of like a gut punch into the body politic that was ailing from these longer term conditions. And if it wasn't for a few 100,000 voters in Ohio and Wisconsin and a couple other states, I think a lot of this would be an unpleasant memory of just a few years' time. So my point is that it's a mistake to think of these changes as changes that have only been around for the last few years. It's a mistake to think of these changes as changes that will produce this type of a political response. And we need to kind of think about this in a longer term way. You don't want to start applying Band-Aids because you're worried about the next election.
Right. But Michael, if Elizabeth Warren and Donald Trump are the two primary candidates,
we'll have it for
you
a
will
while
worry
longer.
more than you're letting on.
I'm still holding hope. I'm still holding out hope.
Okay, so I wanted to give Richard a chance to weigh in just on that point. Like part of his book deals with sort of different responses in different countries, both at a level of policy and at the level of sort of public response to the pressures of automation. And I just wondered if you wanted to weigh in on that a little bit.
Sure. Well, so I think it's worth saying I agree very much that the sort of big changes that have been going on in technology and globalization are not new. But my focus is that it's now going to be coming to the service sector much more than it was before, and that will feel different. For one thing, most of the jobs in manufacturing were eliminated between 1970 and now we're pretty much down to the bare bones, and so that was the only thing. But one of the points I made in the book, and one of the reasons I spent so little time on policy in the book, is because I don't think there's anything new about it. Basically, people will have to change jobs, and we know a lot about how people to change jobs. And I'm not a labor market expert, but it doesn't seem to me that this country is particularly good at helping people change jobs and sharing the pains and gains of technological progress, because productivity is a gain, but is painful. That's the way it works. And many countries have, let's say Northern Europe, they have much more systematic policies to help people adjust. And my side point was that we should not tie it to automation or globalization. Anybody loses their job for any reason, somebody should help them adjust, or there should be a systematic way of sharing the gains and the pains of the technology that comes.
Right.
One of the things that Pascal Lemay said that I loved very much was, trade is painful because it works, and it works because it's painful. And that's a reality. Therefore, you should package globalization policies with domestic policies that help share the pains and gains. And I think the same thing's true of automation. So in Japan, I think, is an excellent example. If you let me just jump that in. Japan doesn't have these massive what do you call it? The ALM, the
Active labor market.
Active labor market policies. Thank you. And but they have communities and the corporations. Traditionally, the corporation would move people around inside the corporation, would retrain them, but that cost of having to leave the factory and go somewhere else was shared with a social mechanism. So it doesn't necessarily have to be governments, but I think we're going to need more of it.
Yeah. Was there anything else that was going on down there that you wanted
Well,
to
they got into a
reply
very
to?
labor market thing, and I was just taking notes. So it's very good.
That's excellent. Okay, we have about 9 minutes, and now's your chance to ask anybody up here a question. If you don't ask a question, I've got other questions to ask. So, yeah.
Thank you. You mentioned Northern Europe and Japan are pretty good at, I guess, retraining their displaced workers, but those are also very small countries that very tightly bound culturally. And America is obviously this big, super diverse place. I mean, can we just so easily import those ideas into America? Is there some other way of doing it?
I really can't speak to that. So Brent asked me to talk about other countries' experiences. Japan's 120 million, so I'm not sure I'd call it a small country, but it is cohesive, as you point out. So I really can't say how it should come here, but I do think that it's different than other places. Canada's not a million miles away in terms of cultural diversity and things, and they seem to do it better. So but I'll leave it to the labor economist to. You seem to be struggling a little bit with the politics of why we haven't seen it yet. So I can't answer that.
Yeah. I mean, I think number one, in Europe, they're more comfortable with 40% average, not marginal, 40% average tax rates. I don't see Grover Norquist having huge influence in Denmark and other places. I think there's an American mindset that's also very different. I mean, European employers are a lot more comfortable with sort of centrally generated mandates. Like, for instance, this idea that every job vacancy has to be listed publicly, and there's some of the countries are starting to get away with that. But would American employers stand for that? So I always have a hard time when people say, you know, we have some conversations in this building about paid family leave. And again, some of my friends on the left say, oh, look at the Europeans. They do 6 months. They do 12 months. It's like, yeah, but this ain't Europe. You know, and I think American employers would react very differently to those kinds of mandates. So there's reasons why they do it there maybe more successfully than here, but I haven't come up with a version that would actually work given who we are and who our employers are.
Right. Another question there. I think the woman.
Hello. I was wondering how your analysis might apply to long-range trucking, which is something that is increasingly becoming, touted as this is where the jobs are, and the fits and starts of the automated car industry, thinking specifically about Tesla, and they might not be making advances quite as quickly as we imagine, and does this maybe throw a wrench in some of your views, your predictions, which you've couched in many careful terms about the future?
So, go ahead.
I think I don't have much to say about long-range trucking, but I do agree with what you said about the early cry wolf things about AI are turning out to be a little slower than we thought. But one of the things in my book, I talk about shelterism, how special interest groups will use existing regulation to slow down the implementation. And one of my favorite examples is, and this is, I read this, I think it's true, but here I'm in Washington, that the US Congress passed laws about letting people test these self-drive vehicles on the US highways, and the Teamsters let them do it for cars but not trucks, as I understand. And so that's a classic example where all the jobs are, where potentially it's the easy thing to do. It's stopped by politics. And just more generally, that we saw with red flag laws, with feather bedding. Every time there's a big technological change, there's a pushback on it using regulations. So I don't think that the long-range truckers' jobs are at risk for at least for a while. But
so what I would add to that is just that AI goes through these boom and bust phases, right? So, there was the AI winter where everybody just said it's never going to happen, you're wasting your time. The last couple of years has been, wow, AI is coming and we're going to be driving your trucks and your cars and making your milkshakes, and it's, there's not going to be anything left to do. And I feel like in the last probably 6 months, we've seen a bit of a turn on that with problems with self-driving vehicles, for instance, trucks, even on long-haul trucking routes, having trouble, or in the worst case, people being injured or killed by cars. So this is a far more complex task than I think that many of the strongest advocates around AI have been willing to admit up to now. But I do think that Richard's observations about sort of the way this is going to kind of seep into the economy and have impact that we won't feel kind of all at once remains really valid. It's going to continue to sort of transform things slowly.
There's a whole branch of economics on what they call the diffusion of technology. how long does it take? And it follows this kind of S shape, very slow at first. You solve most of these basic problems, it's much faster, and then, or like a logistic curve that many of us know. The notion that we're quick to that more vertical with trucking seems to me to be wrong. Just think of the infrastructure that you will need for maintenance of the vehicles, for handling basic traffic issues. We're nowhere near. It's not only that we have to develop that, but then you'd have to implement that all over the country. That's going to take a while.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I like this more concrete examples. So let's staying with that, but on the higher skill level, how about pharmacy? So a pharmacist is an example of a job that had a lot of growth lately in the last 15, 20 years. We've doubled the capacity to produce pharmacists, but yet it's a task that seems a lot like, it's very task-based, and a lot of software kinds of things can be done to do this, and yet at the same time, we haven't changed the number of, we went from producing 7,000 pharmacists a year to 15,000 in a very policy-focused way, and yet there's a lot of people talking about how this is now changing the changing need, but we're not really changing what we're doing about it. And so this is, it seems to me, a good example of a job that's going to be affected. And so could you think through what to do about it in the near term, both in terms, because this is a high education job, not a low one, that seems to be dramatically affected, with machines that apparently can do all of the prescriptions in a hospital with no errors and replace 20 pharmacists overnight. So those kinds of things, what do you do about that? Can you think that through? I would personally benefit from a more concrete example, and that's the best I could come up with. I apologize if there's another one, but that was the example.
I take that example actually in my book. So one of the chapters is to go through all the things and to sort of bring it down to real. So what's happened in pharmacy is something called pill pickers, which are machines. So I tell the case study of a hospital in San Francisco which has a pill-picking machine that fills 80 or 90% of the prescriptions, because most of them are the same. It's like statins and aspirin or whatever. And so this machine replaces a lot of pharmacists. But the number of pharmacists they have on staff didn't go down. It's just that they're no longer counting pills. And so that allowed them to do the more human things. And just to, where could that go? In Europe, I don't know if you're aware, but a lot of times pharmacists do things that only doctors can do here. They can, they can give you a pass and give you a subscription if you need it, and then they ask you, well, the doctor can give it later. They can give flu shots, and they're much more important in the kind of average medicine. People will go and ask them, I'm not sleeping well at night, what should I do? And they'll go to the pharmacist. So in principle, the pharmacists who aren't picking pills anymore or doing automatic checking for interactions between drugs could do more human skills. And there's one thing where we have essentially infinite demand for more medical skills, especially if they're human, to help you think about things. So that I think is a good example where it will be, the job of pharmacists will be completely changed, but we'll probably still need more of them.
Okay, well, 6:15 has arrived. Speaking of books, they're available outside if you would like to purchase a copy of the book. Yes, there are a few out there. And we appreciate you so much coming in this afternoon for this conversation. And thanks so much. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Very good.